So things are going to be a little bit different this week. There's no real change to the format of how I'm presenting things or anything like that. But obviously I'm standing up now, I'm holding the microphone and I'm talking to the camera. I don't think it's going to change anything too drastically, but I think it's just a subtle nudge in a more energetic direction than when I'm sitting down at my computer desk. Now let's just jump straight into the practice. With our smoothness and our precise tracking this week, our scores were overall pretty much average. There was nothing really that stood out, not even one scenario that stood out. There was no new personal best, but there was some increases in average scores, which is also what I'm looking for, not just high scores. Across the board in our reactive tracking, we saw some nice average scores and some pretty good consistency. But the big standout this week in reactive tracking was ground plaza. Now, ground plaza has always been the best scenario for me. I've never had to actually focus on improving in it. So my new personal best in ground plaza voltaic easy is 880 points. And I'm sure many of you are pretty aware that that is the requirement for diamond. So now that gives us our second score in diamond, and I'm very pleased with this. The story for dynamic clicking is pretty much the same as it always is, popcorn being a huge letdown, but surprisingly again this week, I believe last week was also a pretty big surprise. Pasu was very, very consistent across the board. Only some small variances across the board over the 10 runs that I did for practice this week. It was a pretty good week for static scores as well. Popcorn, as always, being by far my most consistent scenario. 1 more 2 target small reload small flick, seeing a new personal best as well this week. Only increasing by 1 small point, but it's still nice to see these small improvements. So moving on to the benchmarks. I think dynamic clicking this week in our benchmarks was the most interesting set of scores. We saw Pasu and Popcorn getting some very consistent scores. Although they didn't see any new personal bests, I think the consistency within those was very, very good to see, especially within my 2 weakest scenarios. Bounce 180 is typically my most enjoyable scenario within the dynamic clicking category. But unfortunately this week, the scores were so far in the toilet, I didn't even want to look at them. But looking at the scores and looking at the accuracy stats and everything else that was going on, I think I figured it out. I think my accuracy was particularly low. While I'm not entirely sure why, I know that that's what I have to focus on for the next couple of weeks to bring those scores back up to where I want them. Now moving on to static, the opposite is true for 6 sphere hipfire voltaic. My accuracy was up to about 10% higher than previous weeks. My scores were so much lower, so I think in the coming weeks our focus should be on speeding up and making sure that I'm still hitting those targets even if I lose a small amount of accuracy. Nothing new to report on Smoothbot, unfortunately, no new personal best, although we did get pretty close with the 2,714 point run. Unfortunately, we're still lagging behind all of my other scores and not yet platinum. Air Angelic 4 saw a new personal best of 3,095 points over the previous 3,021 points. But the biggest standout this week, as again it was in our practice sessions, is Ground Plaza. Now Ground Plaza we saw, as you remember, 880 points in our practice sessions. What we saw in our benchmark sessions was 883 points. So the increase of 880 to 883 I'm obviously very proud of, but it didn't get us anywhere because that's where the easy scenarios stop. So next week I'm going to pull out the easy version of Ground Plaza and put in the advanced version, and hopefully we can see some progress towards Jade in the coming weeks. So overall I'm pretty happy with the improvements that we've made this week. We saw some very good new personal best scores and some very small improvements getting us new personal bests. But even in the scenarios that weren't particularly good and I didn't perform very well in, I still think I've managed to figure out what I might have been doing wrong and something to focus on for the next week, which is always good when you're looking to improve. So I hope you've enjoyed the video and I hope you've enjoyed the new way I'm presenting them. If you have any feedback, whether that is for my aim training or my video production, I would love to hear it in the comments. But other than that, make sure you check out last week's video where we explore what taking a break can do to your aim training.